Right now, across England, landlords are quietly doing the maths. Some are looking at their spreadsheets, others are on the phone to their accountants, and more than a few are staring at the numbers thinking, this does not work anymore. According to the National Residential Landlords Association, over 1 in 3 landlords surveyed immediately after yesterday's budget said they were planning to sell properties in the next 12 months. 1 in 3. We're potentially talking about hundreds of thousands of rental properties disappearing from the market at exactly the time when demand has never been higher. And here's the shocking part. Every single landlord who leaves the market takes a rental property with them. Right now, when renters already face record shortages, rent rises, bidding wars, and properties being snapped up on the same day they're listed, Chancellor Rachel Reeves may have just set off the next rental crisis. Because on November 26, 2025, she stood up in Parliament and announced a 2% tax increase on property income that the government's own forecasters admit will push rents up. Let's talk about how we got here, because this didn't happen overnight. For several years now, being a landlord has been getting progressively harder. It started in April 2017 with Section 24, the mortgage interest restriction that changed how landlords could offset their borrowing costs against tax. Before this change, if you earned £20,000 in rent and paid £15,000 in mortgage interest, you only paid tax on the £5,000 profit. That's how business expenses normally work. You deduct costs before calculating tax. But Section 24 ended that. Now landlords pay tax on the full £20,000 and then receive a basic rate tax credit for the mortgage interest. If you're a higher rate taxpayer, which many landlords are once rental income pushes them over the threshold, this dramatically increases your tax bill. For some landlords, Section 24 alone added thousands of pounds to their annual tax liability. Then came the 3% stamp duty surcharge on additional properties in 2016. If you're buying a rental property for £300,000, you're paying an extra £9,000 in stamp duty compared to someone buying it as their main home. That's a significant upfront cost that immediately reduces returns. Building societies and mortgage lenders tightened their criteria. Interest coverage ratios became more stringent. Lenders started requiring rental income to cover 145% of the mortgage payment at a stressed interest rate, not just the actual rate you're paying. This made it harder to refinance existing properties or buy new ones. Energy performance certificate regulations were strengthened. Since April 2023, all new tenancies must have a minimum EPC rating of E. From April 2025, this applies to all existing tenancies. Upgrading a property from F or G to E can cost anywhere from £5,000 to £15,000 depending on the property. That's money landlords have to invest just to continue renting legally. Local councils introduced selective and additional licensing schemes across dozens of areas. These schemes require landlords to pay for licenses, often several £100s per property, and meet specific management standards. Fail to comply and you face fines of up to £30,000 per property. The Renters' Rights Bill became law in October 2025, bringing further regulation. Section 21, no-fault evictions were abolished. Rent increase restrictions were tightened. Landlords now face longer notice periods and more complex possession procedures. It's been one policy after another, each one chipping away at the viability of buy-to-let. But up until yesterday, it was still possible to make it work if you were careful, if you had a long-term view. If you were willing to hold on to a property and grow your equity over time, there was still a reason to stay. Autumn budget, for many landlords, it feels like the final straw. So what exactly did Chancellor Rachel Reeves announce on November 26th? Let's break this down clearly because the details matter and the implications are more significant than the headlines suggest. The main measure affecting landlords was the creation of separate tax rates for property income. From April 2027, property income will be taxed at higher rates than other income. The property basic rate will be 22% instead of 20%. The property higher rate will be 42% instead of 40%. And the property additional rate will be 47% instead of 45%. That's a 2 percentage point increase across all bands. If you're a landlord earning £50,000 in rental income and paying higher rate tax, your tax bill just went up by £1,000 per year. If you're earning £100,000, it's £2,000. For landlords with substantial portfolios, this could mean several £1,000s in additional tax every single year. Now, the government frames this as a fairness measure. Rachel Reeves stood in Parliament and said that currently, a landlord with an income of £25,000 will pay nearly £1,200 less in tax than their tenant with the same salary, because no national insurance is charged on property income. She's positioning this as narrowing the gap between earned and unearned income. But here's what she didn't emphasize. The Office for Budget Responsibility, in a document that was accidentally leaked before the budget was even announced, explicitly stated that this measure will reduce returns to private landlords and will be passed on to tenants in the form of higher rents. The government's own economic forecasters are saying this will push rents up. That's not speculation from landlord groups, that's the OBR. According to the leaked document, the OBR said the measures announced in this budget reduce returns to private landlords, following various measures over the past 10 years that have also reduced returns. The successive erosion of private landlord returns is likely to reduce the supply of rental property over the long run. This reduction in supply risks a steady long-term rise in rents if demand outstrips supply. So the government knows this will raise rents. They've been told by their own forecasters, and they've done it anyway. The budget also introduced a high-value council tax surcharge, sometimes called a mansion tax. From April 2028, properties worth over £2 million will pay an annual surcharge of £2,500. Properties worth over £5 million will pay £7,500. This will be paid by owners, not occupiers, which means landlords with high-value rental properties face another annual cost. For most landlords, this won't apply. Less than 1% of properties are worth over £2 million. But in London and parts of the southeast, there are landlords with portfolios that include properties at this value. For them, it's another cost that either reduces their return or gets passed to tenants. The budget also confirmed that income tax thresholds will remain frozen until April 2031. That's another 6 years of fiscal drag. As rents rise with inflation, landlords earn more nominal income. But the tax thresholds haven't moved. So more of that income gets taxed at the higher rate of 40%, soon to be 42% for property income, or even the additional rate of 45%, soon to be 47%. Your income goes up. Your tax goes up faster. Your net income barely budges or actually falls in real terms. What the budget didn't do is also significant. There were no changes to stamp duty, despite months of speculation. There were no increases to capital gains tax rates for property, which had been widely rumoured. And crucially, national insurance was not extended to rental income, which had been one of the most feared possibilities. So in some ways, landlords dodged the worst outcomes. But what they got is still significant enough to change the economics fundamentally. Let's look at what this means in practical terms with real numbers, because the abstract policy changes only matter when you see how they affect actual people. According to the National Residential Landlords Association, this 2% tax increase could add between £20 and £25 per month to typical rents in England. That's £240 to £300 per year. For a tenant already paying £1,200 per month, that's a 2% increase just from this tax change alone, before any other market factors. But let's work through a specific example so you can see how the numbers stack up for landlords. Imagine you own a 2-bedroom flat in Reading. You bought it 10 years ago for £270,000 with a 75% mortgage. You've paid down some capital, but you still owe around £185,000. Your tenant pays £1,150 per month. That's £13,800 per year. Your mortgage interest at 5.5% on £185,000 is around £10,175 per year. Because of Section 24, you can't offset that properly. You pay tax on the full £13,800, which pushes you into the higher rate bracket. Currently at 40%. Your tax bill is substantial. From April 2027, at 42% for property income, it gets worse. Let's calculate the difference. Under the current system, you pay income tax at various rates depending on your other income, but let's assume the rental income falls mostly into the higher rate band. you're paying roughly £5,500 in tax after accounting for the basic rate credit for mortgage interest. Under the new system from April 2027, that goes up by 2% on the amount taxed at the higher rate. If roughly £10,000 of your rental income is being taxed at the higher rate, that's an extra £200 per year. Not massive for one property, but it's another cost on top of everything else. Now add in insurance, which has increased by 30 to 40% in the last 2 years. Add in safety certificate costs for gas, electrical and energy performance. Add in letting agent fees if you use one. Add in maintenance and repairs. Add in the occasional void period between tenancies. Add in the cost of complying with the Renters' Rights Act. For many landlords, the profit has already been squeezed to near zero. This extra 2% tax is the difference between breaking even and making a loss. And here's the critical point. Landlords who are making a loss or barely breaking even have two choices. Raise the rent to cover the increased costs, or sell the property and get out of the market entirely. Many are choosing to sell. According to Hamptons, the estate agency and research firm, landlords who operate through personal ownership rather than limited companies are being squeezed by higher borrowing costs and previous tax changes, and this could accelerate the trend of investors exiting the market. Over time, that risks reducing rental supply and pushing rents higher. Ryan Etchells, Chief Commercial Officer at Together, a specialist lender, said while it seems landlords dodged the imposition of national insurance on their income in the budget, the tax collector would still take a sizable bite out of their incomes due to the rise in income tax rates for sole trader landlords who hold properties in their own names. He said all this will inevitably result in higher rents from next year onwards, which could force landlords to sell up altogether if they can't make the numbers stack up, worsening the UK's rental crisis. Let's talk about who actually owns rental properties in the UK, because the popular image of landlords doesn't match reality. According to Nationwide Building Society, around 52% of landlords in the United Kingdom own just one rental property. Another 30% own two. That means over 80% of landlords are small operators with one or two properties. These aren't property moguls with portfolios of 50 flats. They're what are often called accidental landlords. Someone inherited a property from their parents. Someone moved in with a partner and kept their old flat. Someone bought a house, got relocated for work, and decided to rent it out rather than sell. Someone saved for years to buy a rental property as part of their pension planning, because they didn't trust stock markets or traditional pensions after seeing what happened in 2008. For most of these people, rental income is how they pay the mortgage and earn a modest extra income each month. It's not making them wealthy, it's not their primary income, it's supplementary. And many of them provide decent, well-maintained homes to tenants they've had for years. They respond quickly to maintenance issues. They keep rents below market rate because they value stable, reliable tenants. They're not the rogue landlords you read about in the news. But here's what's happening. These small landlords are being told through higher taxes, new levies, tighter regulation, and increased compliance costs that it might be time to sell up. And many of them are listening. Ben Beadle, Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association, responded to the budget by saying that despite claims of tackling cost of living pressures, the government is pursuing a policy that the Office for Budget Responsibility has made clear will drive up rents. He said almost 1 million new homes to rent are needed by 2031. But this budget will clobber tenants with higher costs while doing nothing to improve access to the homes people need. Mark Harris, Chief Executive of SPF Private Clients, a mortgage broker, said the change could be the final nail in the coffin for landlords owning property in their own name. He said it is very hard to make a profit unless properties are held in limited companies, which aren't affected by Section 24 and can still offset mortgage interest properly. And who's replacing these small landlords? Not new small landlords. The barriers to entry are too high now. Stamp duty surcharges, strict lending criteria, complex tax treatment, regulatory requirements. Why would someone starting out today choose buy-to-let when they could invest in stocks, bonds, or commercial property with far less hassle? The answer is they wouldn't, and they aren't. Here's the question nobody in government wants to answer directly. Is this budget simply squeezing landlords for tax revenue? Or is it deliberately replacing small landlords with large corporate ones? Because there's a pattern emerging. Every policy change over the last decade has made life harder for small landlords while being less impactful or even advantageous for large corporate operators. Section 24 affects individual landlords, but not companies who can still offset mortgage interest as a business expense. If you own properties through a limited company, you're not hit by this restriction. Small landlords who own properties in their personal name are. The new 2% property income tax increase only applies to individuals. Limited companies pay corporation tax at 25% on their profits, with full mortgage interest relief. For many portfolios, that's more tax efficient than paying income tax at 42 or 47% with restricted relief. Stamp duty surcharges apply to individuals buying additional properties, but can be structured around more easily by corporate entities, making bulk purchases or buying entire developments. Licensing schemes and regulatory compliance are expensive per property for small landlords managing one or two homes. For corporate landlords with professional management teams and hundreds of properties, the cost per unit is far lower. Energy efficiency requirements are expensive for individual landlords upgrading old properties one at a time. Build-to-rent companies construct new buildings that meet current standards from day one. They don't face the retrofitting costs. The Renters' Rights Act brings complex new obligations around rent increases, possession procedures, and tenant protection. Small landlords managing properties themselves find this burdensome. Corporate landlords with legal teams and professional property managers handle it as part of their standard operations. You see the pattern? Every change pushes out the small operator and favors the large professional one. Build-to-rent is growing as a sector. These are purpose-built developments owned by institutional investors and managed professionally. Companies like Granger, Moda Living, and Get Living are expanding rapidly. They're building thousands of new rental homes. They have access to cheap institutional finance. They can ride out policy changes because they're playing a long game spanning decades. But they're selective. They want city centers, good transport links, high-demand areas. They're not building in small towns, rural areas, or less fashionable neighborhoods. If you're a family needing a 3-bedroom house with a garden in a suburb or a small town, build-to-rent isn't solving your problem. And corporate landlords, like any business, are driven by profit maximization. If they achieve dominant positions in certain areas because small landlords have exited and there's no competition, what stops them raising rents aggressively? They'll say it's market pricing. Tenants will say it's exploitation. Either way, rents go up. The rental market is being corporatized, professionalized, consolidated. Whether that's deliberate government policy or an unintended consequence doesn't really matter to the people affected. The direction of travel is clear. Mum and dad landlords are being pushed out, corporate landlords are stepping in, and tenants are caught in the middle. Let's talk about what happened on Budget Day itself, because it was chaotic and it reveals something important about how government actually works. On the morning of November 26th, before Rachel Reeves even stood up in Parliament, the Office for Budget Responsibility accidentally published their full economic forecast online. This was supposed to be embargoed until after the Chancellor's speech. It's a serious breach of protocol. The Deputy Speaker, Nusrat Ghani, criticized it as unprecedented. But that leak told us something crucial. It showed what the government's own economic forecasters really think about these policies, in language they might have softened if they'd had more time. The OBR document explicitly stated that the measures announced in this budget reduce returns to private landlords, following various measures over the past 10 years that have also reduced returns. It said the successive erosion of private landlord returns is likely to reduce the supply of rental property over the long run. This reduction in supply risks a steady long-term rise in rents if demand outstrips supply. That's the government's own forecasting body saying this will push rents up. Not might, will, they're stating it as a likely consequence. The document also said that some of the increased tax burden will be passed through to tenants in the form of higher rents, but that this would be offset to some degree by increased downward pressure on house prices as returns fall and some landlords exit. So the theory is that yes, rents will go up, but house prices might come down as landlords sell, making it easier for people to buy. The problem with this theory is that it assumes the people currently renting can afford to buy if prices fall slightly. For most renters, that's not the case. They're renting because they can't save a deposit while paying current rents. If rents go up further, their ability to save gets worse, not better. The OBR forecast shows this budget is expected to raise around £500 million per year from the property income tax increase. That sounds like a lot, but in the context of total government spending of over £1 trillion per year, it's tiny. It's 0.05%. The government is fundamentally reshaping the rental market for £500 million. Some analysts have suggested this is more about political messaging than revenue. Labour wants to be seen as taxing wealth and assets, not working people. Landlords are an easy target politically. Many voters don't own rental properties and don't have sympathy for landlords. Squeezing them plays well with the base, but the consequences are real regardless of the motivation. Let's talk about regional variations, because this doesn't affect all parts of the UK equally. In London and the South East, where house prices and rents are highest, the impact is amplified. If you're a landlord in London with a property bought years ago, you might have substantial equity, but your mortgage costs have still increased with interest rates. The rental income might look good on paper, but after tax at 42% from 2027, after mortgage interest that can't be fully offset, after all the compliance costs, the actual return is modest. And now you're also potentially facing the high-value council tax surcharge if your property is worth over £2 million. In some London boroughs, that's not unusual. A 4-bedroom house in Wandsworth or Hammersmith that you bought 20 years ago for £400,000 could now be worth £2.5 million. You're suddenly paying an extra £2,500 per year just for owning it. If it's a rental property, that cost either comes out of your profit or gets passed to the tenant. According to Zoopla, average monthly rent in London is now over £2,100. That's £25,200 per year. For a household earning the London median income of around £45,000, that's over half their gross income going on rent. It's unsustainable, and it's getting worse. In the North and Midlands, where houses cost less, the absolute pound amounts are smaller. A landlord in Newcastle with a property worth £150,000, charging £850 per month rent, faces a smaller tax increase in absolute terms, maybe an extra £150 to £200 per year. But proportionally, it has the same impact on returns. And here's the thing, wages in cheaper areas are also lower. A household in Newcastle earning £35,000 is proportionally as stretched by rent increases as a London household earning £70,000 paying higher rents. The relative pain is similar even if the numbers look different. Scotland and Northern Ireland have devolved powers over some tax matters. The budget documents say the UK government will engage with the Scottish and Welsh governments to provide them with the ability to set property income rates in line with their current income tax powers. So Scotland might implement this differently or not at all, but the fundamentals are the same. Small landlords under pressure, rental supply at risk. Rents rising. Wales has been particularly active on rental regulation. They introduced rent controls in certain areas and strengthened tenant protections beyond England's standards. Now they're facing the same supply squeeze as landlords exit. The Welsh government has warned that continued loss of landlords will deepen affordability issues for tenants and increase pressure on local authorities to house more people in the social sector. 19 Hadar, 21.15. What happens next? So what's actually going to happen over the next few years? Let's map this out based on what we know and what the patterns tell us. Firstly, more landlords will sell. Some immediately because they've been on the fence and this budget tipped them over. Others gradually as they come to the end of fixed-rate mortgages or face unexpected repair costs that make continuing unviable. The NRLA survey showing 1 in 3 landlords planning to sell in the next 12 months is significant. Even if only half of them follow through, that's a substantial reduction in rental supply. Secondly, rental supply will tighten further. Every property that leaves the rental market reduces supply unless it's replaced by a new rental property, which is increasingly unlikely. We're already seeing this. Rightmove data shows advertised rental properties are down across many areas compared to previous years. When landlords sell, some properties are bought by first-time buyers and become owner-occupied. That's good for home ownership rates, but bad for rental availability. Thirdly, competition for rental properties will intensify. This is already happening in cities like Bristol, Manchester, Brighton and London. Renters report turning up to viewings with dozens of other prospective tenants. Properties are being let on the same day they're advertised, sometimes above the asking rent as people bid against each other out of desperation. When supply is tight and demand is high, prices rise. Rents will continue increasing. The NRLA estimate of £20 to £25 per month from this tax change alone is just the start. Market forces will push rents higher as supply shrinks. We could be looking at rent increases of 10 to 15% year on year in high-demand areas. Fourthly, more renters will struggle to find anywhere at all. It's not just about affordability anymore. It's about availability. If there are 15 households competing for every available property, 14 of them don't get it. Where do they go? They stay in unsuitable properties longer. They commute from further away. They move in with family. They house share well into their 30s or 40s. In the worst cases, they approach their local council as homeless. Local authorities are already overwhelmed. According to Shelter, statutory homelessness has risen significantly in the last few years. Councils are spending record amounts on temporary accommodation, housing families in hotels and bed and breakfasts at enormous cost. One estimate suggests councils are spending over £1.7 billion per year on temporary accommodation. If private rental supply continues shrinking while demand stays high, this crisis intensifies. Fifthly, the landlords who stay in the market will be forced to increase rents to cover their higher costs. If your tax bill has gone up by several hundred or several £1,000s and you can't absorb that loss, you raise the rent. Your existing tenant might not be able to afford it. If they leave, you find someone who can. That's harsh, but it's rational economic behavior when costs increase. And finally, political pressure will build for further intervention. Rent controls are being discussed more openly. Some campaign groups are calling for them. The government will face increasing pressure from tenants struggling with affordability and from councils dealing with homelessness. But rent controls are deeply controversial. Economists argue they reduce supply in the long term because landlords exit and developers don't build rental properties if returns are capped. The evidence from other countries is mixed. Let's bring this back to what it actually means for real people watching this video. If you're a renter, expect rents to keep rising. This 2% property income tax increase will likely be passed through to you, either directly or indirectly, as landlords adjust to higher costs. Budget for rent increases of 5 to 10% or more over the next couple of years, especially in high-demand areas. That's not a prediction, that's preparation. Your best strategy is to build a relationship with your landlord if you can. If you're a reliable tenant who pays on time, doesn't cause problems, and looks after the property, you're valuable. Your landlord might be more willing to keep your rent below market rate to retain you rather than face the hassle and cost of finding a new tenant. It's worth having that conversation. Consider negotiating a longer tenancy agreement if your landlord is open to it. A 2-year or even 3-year fixed-term tenancy with agreed modest rent increases built in gives you security and predictability. Many landlords prefer longer tenancies because they reduce void periods and turnover costs. If you're trying to buy, this might create opportunities, but don't count on it. Some landlords selling will create more properties available for purchase. But you're competing with other buyers, and mortgage rates are still relatively high. Don't wait for a crash that might never come. If you can afford to buy now, and it makes sense for your circumstances, do it. Waiting rarely works out as well as people hope. If you're a landlord, you need to seriously evaluate your position. Run the numbers honestly. What's your actual net return after all costs and taxes, including the new rates from April 2027? If it's negative or barely positive, why are you doing this? Consider whether incorporating makes sense. If you're a higher rate taxpayer and you own multiple properties in your personal name, moving them into a limited company structure could be more tax efficient. You can offset mortgage interest properly. Corporation tax at 25% might be lower than income tax at 42 or 47%. But incorporation has costs, including stamp duty if you transfer properties and ongoing accounting fees. You need professional advice. It's not right for everyone, but it's worth exploring. If you're planning to sell, think about timing. The new property income tax rates don't take effect until April 2027. The mansion tax doesn't start until April 2028. You have time. But if lots of landlords decide to sell at the same time, supply increases and prices might soften. Don't panic sell, but don't ignore the changing economics either. If you're thinking about becoming a landlord, think very carefully. Buy-to-let is not the passive income opportunity it was 10 or 15 years ago. It's more like running a small business with significant regulatory obligations, financial risk, and active management required. The barriers to entry are high, the ongoing costs are substantial, and the returns might not justify the effort unless you're very strategic about what and where you buy and how you structure ownership. 23 Audyan 2430. The bigger picture. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just about landlords and tenants. It's about how housing works in Britain and who it works for. For decades, successive governments have relied on private landlords to house millions of people. Social housing was allowed to decline. Right to buy sold off council homes that were never adequately replaced. The assumption was that the private rental sector would fill the gap. And for a while, it did. The number of private landlords grew from around 1 million in the late 1990s to over 2.7 million by 2015. But that model is breaking down. Private landlords provided rental housing because it was profitable and relatively straightforward. Now it's increasingly neither. Returns have been eroded by tax changes, regulatory requirements, higher costs, and increased complexity. So landlords are leaving, and the government hasn't built enough social housing to replace them. The result is a rental market that doesn't work for anyone. Tenants pay record rents for insecure tenancies and face fierce competition for properties. Landlords earn minimal returns for significant hassle, risk, and regulatory burden. Only corporate landlords with scale, professional management, and access to institutional finance can make it work consistently. And they're not providing enough supply to replace the small landlords who are exiting. This budget didn't create this situation. The erosion of private landlord returns has been happening for over a decade through multiple governments. But this budget has accelerated trends that were already underway. The corporatization of rental housing, the decline of small landlords, the increasing unaffordability for renters. The question is whether the government understands these dynamics or whether they're making policy without fully considering the consequences. The OBR has warned them explicitly that this will reduce supply and push rents up. They've done it anyway. That suggests either they think the trade-offs are worth it for other reasons, or they're prioritizing short-term political messaging over long-term housing policy. Sarah Coles, head of personal finance at Hargreaves Lansdown, said an income tax hike was the most feared change in the budget, and it made millions of people's worst fears a reality. She noted that everyone, whatever their income, needs to consider steps they can take to protect themselves from the cumulative impact of these changes. The next rental crisis might not look dramatic. It won't be a sudden collapse. It will be slow, steady, and hard to stop. Year after year of declining supply, rising rents, and increasing desperation among renters trying to find somewhere decent they can afford. Families stuck in unsuitable accommodation. Young people unable to move out of their parents' homes. Key workers unable to afford to live near their jobs. Homelessness rising as the safety net phrase. So where does this leave us? The government says this budget is about fairness, about making sure income from assets contributes as much as income from work. Landlords say they're being driven out by taxes and regulation that ignore the realities of providing rental housing. Tenants are caught in the middle, facing higher rents and fewer choices because of a supply crisis nobody seems willing or able to fix. The truth is that all of these perspectives have some validity. Income from assets probably should contribute more to tax revenues. But you can't squeeze landlords without affecting tenants when the two are directly connected. And you can't reduce rental supply while demand is rising without creating a crisis. Policy is made at the aggregate level, and at that level, the consequences of this budget are predictable. Less rental supply as small landlords exit. Higher rents as remaining landlords pass through costs. More corporate landlords filling the gap in select areas. More struggling renters competing for fewer properties. More pressure on councils to provide emergency housing they can't afford. You should be asking yourself what this means for your situation. If you're renting, can you absorb another rent increase next year? If you're a landlord, do the numbers still work with the new tax rates? If you're trying to buy, how does this change your timeline? What do you think? Should the government support small landlords to keep the rental market stable? Or should corporate landlords take over and bring professional? Is there a better model entirely that we're not considering? Is this budget fair or does it miss the point? Are you a landlord thinking of selling? Are you a renter worried about what comes next? Let me know in the comments. These conversations matter because housing affects everyone, and the decisions being made now will shape the market for years to come.